Okay, so this is going to be a review of chapter 3 and 4 and a quick discussion about the presence of anti-Semitism in the picture of Dorian Gray. Okay, so chapter 3. In this chapter, Lord Henry visits his uncle, Lord Fermor, to go find out the details concerning Dorian's past. We refer to this plot device as a deus ex machina, which means God in the machine. Uncle Lord Fermor only makes an appearance once in Dorian Gray, and he never appears again. His sole function is to enter in at this point in the plot, deliver this information about Dorian Gray, and that's basically all that he does. So God in the machine, meaning just a character or a device that solves the problem of the plot, meaning this is where we need to learn about Dorian's past. And then once that problem is solved, the character then is not present again in the rest of the story. So this is a person or thing that is introduced into a situation suddenly and unexpectedly, provides a contrived solution, and then is not useful anymore, isn't a part of the plot. Lord Fermor gives us the following information. Dorian is the grandson of Lord Kelso and stands to inherit a large fortune from his grandfather. Dorian's mother, Lady Margaret Devereux, was a beautiful woman who married a penniless man. Lord Kelso was unhappy with his daughter marrying beneath her station and essentially had Dorian's father murdered. He hires a impertinent ruffian, a character who is likely to be hostile in any kind of a violent situation. And this ruffian challenges Dorian's father to a duel, and the whole course of events leads to Dorian's father dying. Lady Margaret dies soon after, and presumably she dies likely of a broken heart. So Dorian is left with no parents, but he is related to the wealthy Lord Kelso, and Lady Margaret also had some money of her own. So he has inherited a fortune and is now a part of the upper crust of society. In chapter 4, Dorian begins to show some signs of moral decline. About a month later, Dorian waits for Lord Henry in Henry's library at the Mayfair. He is sulking and annoyed until someone interrupts his mood. It is not Lord Henry, but Lord Henry's wife. So in this portion of the chapter, and in many portions with Lord Henry, and certainly with his wife, we have, again, a comedy of manners. So these are witty back and forth meant to satirize the upper class of society. Lord Henry often speaks in paradoxes, so does his wife. They are married in parallel, but their social circles rarely intersect, and they seem to be perfectly happy with their very strange and unusual marriage. After Lady Henry leaves, Lord Henry, again, sort of makes jokes about the disappointments of marriage, and Dorian volunteers that he will never marry because he is much, much too in love with an actress named Sybil Vane. This intrigues Lord Henry, and so Dorian goes on to explain how he met this young actress. One evening, he was in front of a very low-class theater, a poor theater. This would have been, not a brothel, certainly, but certainly not a place for upper aristocratic men like Dorian. But he is out in front of the theater when he describes, in his words, there is a hideous Jew, the owner of the theater named Mr. Isaac, who draws Dorian in and provokes Dorian Finally, Dorian, out of sheer interest, sheer curiosity, pays for a private theater where he sees Romeo and Juliet played by the actress Sybil Vane. Her performance is very captivating to Dorian, magnificent, and her appearance is quite beautiful. Dorian immediately falls in love with this actress on the stage. But it's important to note that he falls in love with her performance and certainly not the woman playing those characters, the real person underneath. After that night, he returns to the theater every night to see Sybil Vane, and what makes her performance even more interesting is that she becomes a different woman every night. She is Cleopatra, she is Juliet, she is Rosalind, which is another Shakespearean character. So she gets to sort of be all of these things, a never-ending source of entertainment to Dorian. So Dorian's anti-Semitism, when he refers to Mr. Isaacs, the theater owner, Dorian is spouting racist, anti-Semitic stereotypes that show the reader that he is clearly not the innocent and charming young man that he was at the beginning of the novel. Dorian was a fresh flower, the toast of the town, a complete, innocent, young, enthusiastic, captivating to all in his company. But by chapter 4, he started to say and do things that are certainly unlikable. And that starts to chip away at that sense of youth and innocence that he had at the beginning. Dorian's dislike of Isaacs, and when he draws on these anti-Semitic, racist tropes, would have been startling to any reader. Certainly they're startling to us today, but even in the Victorian period, it is not as if every person in the Victorian era was a raging anti-Semite and Dorian's words would have been considered completely normal. But Dorian was drawing on well-known stereotypes, and he's spouting that anti-Semitism, and that's part of what makes him unlikable, really from chapter 4 on. What he says about Mr. Isaacs is what many people stereotype the Jewish businessman as: scheming, immoral, and greedy. Dorian objectifies Sybil Vane. He views her simply as a work of art for his own pleasure. Likewise, he obsesses over Mr. Isaacs as her monstrous captor. So Dorian casts himself as the hero of his story who will free Sybil from this terrible person holding her in captivity. What he's doing is reducing both people to mere players in his own selfish story. He dehumanizes both Sybil by idealizing her as an object of beauty, and he certainly dehumanizes Mr. Isaacs in this racist, stereotypical way. So it is true that anti-Semitism was common during Wilde's day. Like any piece of literature, we have to look at it through a historical lens. However, it is likely that Dorian's reaction to Isaacs is our first evidence of his growing moral decline, that Oscar Wilde himself wanted Dorian to be unlikable, and so he has Dorian do something very unlikable by spouting off this racist language toward Mr. Isaacs. The stereotypes that Dorian verbalizes here basically fall into three categories of anti-Semitism. The first is demonization. During the Middle Ages, and most likely even before that, Jewish people were frequently described as children of the devil, often portrayed in cartoons or in artistic works with horns or bulging eyes. You may have seen that when you studied Night in ninth grade, if you looked at any Nazi propaganda, political cartoons aimed at demonizing the Jewish people with these physical attributes, but also personal attributes like arrogance and devious logic, sort of cast after the qualities of a satanic figure. The next category would be dirt and disease. Jewish people racistly have been long described as literally or metaphorically characters of a physical defect, deformity, or disease. You can see how that very old stereotype, again dating back to the medieval period or before, sort of transitions into the Nazi philosophy of racial inferiority by the 20th century. And the final category here is money and criminality. When Dorian speaks of Mr. Isaacs as being greedy and as suppressing the beauty and the artistry of Sybil in order to make money, that falls into this category. So this is the idea that the Jewish businessman has frequently depicted as part of a wealthy, powerful collective, a large group of unnamed people that control the money and the wealth of everyone, and they demand the sacrifices of others to satisfy their own greed. Now, these stereotypes, again, they're very, very old, and they were common during Wilde's day in the Victorian period, but they carry on very much today. Oftentimes they'll be coded in more subtle ways, subtle language, but the general racism and anti-Semitism is certainly underneath. So was Wilde himself anti-Semitic? What are we to make of these passages? So this is from the Victorian Web, which I know some of you have used for your research. It reads, "There is no trace of anti-Semitism in any of Wilde's other works. His personal life, moreover, Wilde had several Jewish friends, most notable of whom was Ada Leverson, whom he called the Sphinx. His friendship with Ada Leverson began before he published The Picture of Dorian Gray and continued until the end of his life. She was one of Wilde's guests at the opening performance of The Importance of Being Earnest. And after Wilde's disgrace, when his homosexuality was disclosed, his former friends deserted him, but Ada stood by his side. She and her husband firmly stood by him and remained helpful and loyal until the end. Between trials, for instance, Wilde stayed in their home. Ernest Leverson visited him in prison, and on release, Ada Leverson was waiting to receive him. This does not exonerate Wilde of the charge of insensitivity, however. It is difficult to imagine reading Wilde's novel without being offended by the passages on Isaacs. And certainly it is jarring and upsetting to read those words as seen by Dorian. It's worth noting that in recent editions of The Picture of Dorian Gray, some have gone so far as to tamper and tone down the anti-Semitic rhetoric from Dorian, for instance, changing the word Jew altogether with the word man or manager to soften the language. So be the judge when you come to chapter 4. Wilde is drawing on a stock stereotype of Jewish people in order to convey that Dorian is declining morally, that he is sinking into evil. So Dorian's growing selfishness and his inability to relate to others with humanity and kindness, his growing need to objectify those around him, that is all part of showing Dorian's descent into depravity. So whether you think that is a useful tactic to show us Dorian's change of character, or maybe you consider it to be a bit too distracting, or maybe you fall into the category that it is just plain offensive, it's still really a debatable and open question. And I leave it to you to react as you will. So that last question on The Picture of Dorian Gray and anti-Semitism is open for you to give your own response.